Tasmania is an island state of Australia. It is located 240 kilometers to the south of the Australian mainland, and is separated from it by the Bass Strait. The state encompasses the main island of Tasmania, the 26th largest island in the world, and the surrounding 1,000 islands. It is Australia's smallest and least populous state, with 573,479 residents as of June 2023. The state capital and largest city is Hobart, with around 40% of the population living in the Greater Hobart area. Tasmania is the most decentralised state in Australia, with the lowest proportion of its residents living within its capital city. Tasmania's main island was inhabited by Aboriginal peoples. It is thought that Aboriginal Tasmanians became separated from the mainland Aboriginal groups about 11,700 years ago, after rising sea levels formed Bass Strait. The island was permanently settled by Europeans in 1803 as a penal settlement of the British Empire to prevent claims to the land by the First French Empire during the Napoleonic Wars. The Aboriginal population is estimated to have been between 3,000 and 7,000 at the time of British settlement, but was almost wiped out within 30 years during a period of conflicts with settlers known as the Black War and the spread of infectious diseases. The conflict, which peaked between 1825 and 1831 and led to more than 3 years of martial law, cost the lives of almost 1,100 Aboriginal people and settlers. Under British rule, the island was initially part of the colony of New South Wales. However, it became a separate colony under the name Van Diemen's Land, named after Anthony Van Diemen in 1825. Approximately 80,000 convicts were sent to Van Diemen's Land before this practice, known as transportation, ceased in 1853. In 1855, the present Constitution of Tasmania was enacted, and the following year the colony formally changed its name to Tasmania. In 1901, it became a state of Australia through the process of the Federation of Australia. Today, Tasmania has the second smallest economy of the Australian states and territories, and comprises principally tourism, agriculture, aquaculture, education, and health care. Tasmania is a significant agricultural exporter, as well as a significant destination for ecotourism. About 42% of its land area, including national parks and World Heritage Sites, is protected in some form of reserve. The first environmental political party in the world was founded in Tasmania. History. The island was adjoined to the mainland of Australia until the end of the last glacial period about 11,700 years ago. Much of the island is composed of Jurassic dolerite intrusions through other rock types, sometimes forming large columnar joints. Tasmania has the world's largest areas of dolerite, with many distinctive mountains and cliffs formed from this rock type. The Central Plateau and the southeast portions of the island are mostly dolerites. Mount Wellington above Hobart is a good example, showing distinct columns known as the organ pipes. In the southern Midlands as far south as Hobart, the dolerite is underlaid by sandstone and similar sedimentary stones. In the southwest, Precambrian quartzites were formed from very ancient sea sediments and form strikingly sharp ridges and ranges, such as Federation Peak or French Man's Cap. In the northeast and east, continental granites can be seen, such as at Freycinet, similar to coastal granites on mainland Australia. In the northwest and west, mineral-rich volcanic rock can be seen at Mount Reed near Rosebery, or at Mount Lyell near Queenstown. Also present in the south and northwest is limestone with caves. The quartzite and dolerite areas in the higher mountains show evidence of glaciation, and much of Australia's glaciated landscape is found on the Central Plateau and the southwest. Cradle Mountain, another dolerite peak, for example, was a nunatak. The combination of these different rock types contributes to scenery which is distinct from any other region of the world. In the far southwest corner of the state, the geology is almost wholly quartzite, which gives the mountains the false impression of having snow-capped peaks year-round. Aboriginal people. Evidence indicates the presence of Aboriginal people in Tasmania about 42,000 years ago. Rising sea levels cut Tasmania off from mainland Australia about 10,000 years ago, and by the time of European contact, the Aboriginal people in Tasmania had 9 major nations or ethnic groups. At the time of the British occupation and colonisation in 1803, the indigenous population was estimated at between 3,000 and 10,000. Historian Lyndall Ryan's analysis of population studies led her to conclude that there were about 7,000 spread throughout the island's 9 nations. Nicholas Clements, citing research by N.J.B. Plumley and Rhys Jones, settled on a figure of 3,000 to 4,000. They engaged in fire stick farming, hunted game including kangaroo and wallabies, caught seals, mutton birds, shellfish and fish, and lived as 9 separate nations on the island, which they knew as Trawuna. European arrival and governance. The first reported sighting of Tasmania by a European was on November 24, 1642 by Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, who landed at today's Blackman Bay. More than a century later, in 1772, a French expedition led by Marc-Joseph Marion Dufresne landed at Blackman's Bay, and the following year Tobias Furneaux became the first Englishman to land in Tasmania when he arrived at Adventure Bay, which he named after his ship HMS Adventure. Captain James Cook also landed at Adventure Bay in 1777. Matthew Flinders and George Bass sailed through Bass Strait in 1798 to 1799, determining for the first time that Tasmania was an island. Sealers and whalers based themselves on Tasmania's islands from 1798, and in August 1803 New South Wales Governor Philip King sent Lieutenant John Bowen to establish a small military outpost on the eastern shore of the Derwent River in order to forestall any claims to the island by French explorers who had been exploring the southern Australian coastline. Bowen, who led a party of 49, including 21 male and 3 female convicts, named the Camp Riston. Several months later, a second settlement was established by Captain David Collins, with 308 convicts, 5 kilometers to the south in Sullivan's Cove on the western side of the Derwent, where fresh water was more plentiful. The latter settlement became known as Hobart Town or Hobarton, later shortened to Hobart, after the British colonial secretary of the time, Lord Hobart. The settlement at Riston was later abandoned. Left on their own without further supplies, the Sullivan's Cove settlement suffered severe food shortages, and by 1806 its inhabitants were starving, with many resorting to scraping seaweed off rocks and scavenging washed-up whale blubber from the shore to survive. A smaller colony was established at Port Dalrymple on the Tamar River in the island's north in October 1804, and several other convict-based settlements were established, including the particularly harsh penal colonies at Port Arthur in the southeast and Macquarie Harbour on the west coast. Tasmania was eventually sent 75,000 convicts, 4 out of every 10 people transported to Australia. By 1819, the Aboriginal and British population reached parity with about 5,000 of each, although among the colonists men outnumbered women 4 to 1. Free settlers began arriving in large numbers from 1820, lured by the promise of land grants and free convict labor. Settlement in the island's northwest corner was monopolized by the Van Diemen's Land Company, which sent its first surveyors to the district in 1826. By 1830, 1/3 of Australia's non-Indigenous population lived in Van Diemen's Land, and the island accounted for about half of all land under cultivation and exports. Black War. Tensions between Tasmania's Aboriginal and white inhabitants rose, partly driven by increasing competition for kangaroo and other game. Explorer and naval officer John Oxley in 1810 noted the many atrocious cruelties inflicted on Aboriginal people by convict bushrangers in the north, which in turn led to black attacks on solitary white hunters. Hostilities increased further with the arrival of 600 colonists from Norfolk Island between 1807 and 1813. They established farms along the River Derwent and east and west of Launceston, occupying 10% of Van Diemen's Land. By 1824 the colonial population had swelled to 12,600, while the island's sheep population had reached 200,000. The rapid colonization transformed traditional kangaroo hunting grounds into farms with grazing livestock as well as fences, hedges, and stone walls, while police and military patrols were increased to control the convict farm laborers. Violence began to spiral rapidly from the mid-1820s in what became described as the Black War. Aboriginal inhabitants were driven to desperation by hunger, that included a desire for agricultural produce, as well as feeling anger at the prevalence of abductions of women and girls. New settlers motivated by fear carried out self-defense operations as well as attacks as a means of suppressing the native threat, or even in some cases, exacting revenge. Van Diemen's Land had an enormous gender imbalance, with male colonists outnumbering females 6-1 in 1822 and 16-1 among the convict population. Historian Nicholas Clements has suggested the voracious appetite for native women was the most important trigger for the explosion of violence from the late 1820s. From 1825 to 1828, the number of native attacks more than doubled each year, raising panic among settlers. Over the summer of 1826 to 1827 clans from the Big River, Oyster Bay, and North Midlands nations speared stock keepers on farms and made it clear that they wanted the settlers and their sheep and cattle to move from their kangaroo hunting grounds. Settlers responded vigorously, resulting in many mass killings. In November 1826, Governor Sir George Arthur issued a government notice declaring that colonists were free to kill Aboriginal people when they attacked settlers or their property, and in the following 8 months more than 200 Aboriginal people were killed in the settled districts in reprisal for the deaths of 15 colonists. After another 8 months, the death toll had risen to 43 colonists and probably 350 Aboriginal people. In April 1828, Arthur issued a proclamation of demarcation forbidding Aboriginal people to enter the settled districts without a passport issued by the government. Arthur declared martial law in the colony in November that year, and this remained in force for over 3 years, the longest period of martial law in Australian history. In November 1830, Arthur organized the so-called Black Line, ordering every able-bodied male colonist to assemble at one of 7 designated places in the settled districts to join a massive drive to sweep Aboriginal people out of the region and onto the Tasman Peninsula. The campaign failed and was abandoned 7 weeks later, but by then Tasmania's Aboriginal population had fallen to about 300. Removal of Aboriginal people. After hostilities between settlers and Aboriginal people ceased in 1832, almost all of the remnants of the indigenous population were persuaded by government agent George Augustus Robinson to move to Flinders Island. Many quickly succumbed to infectious diseases to which they had no immunity, reducing the population further. Of those removed from Tasmania, the last to die was Truganini, in 1876. The near destruction of Tasmania's Aboriginal population has been described as an act of genocide by historians including Robert Hughes, James Boyce, Lyndall Ryan, and Tom Lawson. However, other historians including Henry Reynolds, Richard Broome, and Nicholas Clements do not agree with the genocide thesis, arguing that the colonial authorities did not intend to destroy the Aboriginal population in whole or in part. Boyce has claimed that the April 1828 proclamation separating the Aborigines from the white inhabitants sanctioned force against Aboriginal people for no other reason than that they were Aboriginal. However, as Reynolds, Broome and Clements point out, there was open warfare at the time. Boyce described the decision to remove all Tasmanian Aboriginal people after 1832, by which time they had given up their fight against white colonists, as an extreme policy position. He concluded, the colonial government from 1832 to 1838 ethnically cleansed the western half of Van Diemen's Land. Nevertheless, Clements and Flood note that there was another wave of violence in northwest Tasmania in 1841, involving attacks on settlers' huts by a band of Aboriginal Tasmanians who had not been removed from the island. Proclamation as a colony. Van Diemen's Land, which thus far had existed as a territory within the colony of New South Wales, was proclaimed a separate colony, with its own judicial establishment and legislative council, on December 3, 1825. Transportation to the island ceased in 1853 and the colony was renamed Tasmania in 1856, partly to differentiate the burgeoning society of free settlers from the island's convict past. The Legislative Council of Van Diemen's Land drafted a new constitution which gained royal assent in 1855. The Privy Council also approved the colony changing its name from Van Diemen's Land to Tasmania, and in 1856 the newly elected bicameral parliament sat for the first time, establishing Tasmania as a self-governing colony of the British Empire. The colony suffered from economic fluctuations, but for the most part was prosperous, experiencing steady growth. With few external threats and strong trade links with the empire, Tasmania enjoyed many fruitful periods in the late 19th century, becoming a world center of shipbuilding. It raised a local defense force that eventually played a significant role in the Second Boer War in South Africa, and Tasmanian soldiers in that conflict won the first 2 Victoria Crosses awarded to Australians. Federation. In 1901, the colony of Tasmania united with the 5 other Australian colonies to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Tasmanians voted in favour of federation with the largest majority of all the Australian colonies. Tasmania was an early adopter of electric street lighting. Australia's first electric street lights were switched on in Werribee in 1886. Launceston became the first completely electrified city on the island in 1885, followed closely by the township of Zeehan in 1900. The state economy was riding mining prosperity until World War I. In 1901, the state population was 172,475. The 1910 foundation of what would become Hydro Tasmania began to shape urban patterns, as well as future major damming programs. Hydro's influence culminated in the 1970s when the state government announced plans to flood environmentally significant Lake Pedder. As a result of the eventual flooding of Lake Pedder, the world's first Green Party was established, the United Tasmania Group. National and international attention surrounded the campaign against the Franklin Dam in the early 1980s. Tasmanian Enid Lyons became the first female member of the House of Representatives at the 1943 federal election and first female to serve in the federal cabinet. In May 1948, Margaret McIntyre achieved another milestone as the first female elected to the Parliament of Tasmania. Less than 6 months after her election, McIntyre died in the crash of the Lutna near Quirindi on September 2, 1948. After the end of World War II, the state saw major urbanization, and the growth of towns like Ulverstone. It gained a reputation as sanatorium of the South and a health-focused tourist boom began to grow. The MS Princess of Tasmania began her maiden voyage in 1959, the first car ferry to Tasmania. As part of the boom, Tasmania allowed the opening of the first casino in Australia in 1968. Queen Elizabeth II visited the state in 1954, and the 50s and 60s were charactered by the opening of major public services, including the Tasmanian Housing Department and Metro Tasmania public bus services. A jail was opened at Riston in 1960, and the State Library of Tasmania the same year. The University of Tasmania also moved to its present location in 1963. The state was badly affected by the 1967 Tasmanian fires, killing 64 people and destroying over 652,000 acres in 5 hours. In 1975 the Tasman Bridge collapsed when the bridge was struck by the bulk ore carrier Lake Illawarra. It was the only bridge in Hobart, and made crossing the Derwent River by road at the city impossible. The nearest bridge was approximately 20 kilometers to the north, at Bridgewater. Throughout the 1980s, strong environmental concerns saw the building of the Australian Antarctic Division headquarters, and the proclamation of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. The Franklin Dam was blocked by the federal government in 1983, and XRO opened its Marine Studies Centre in Hobart. Pope John Paul II would hold Mass at Elwick Racecourse in 1986. The 1990s were characterized by the fight for LGBT rights in Tasmania, culminating in the intervention of the United Nations Human Rights Committee in 1997 and the decriminalization of homosexuality that year. Christine Milne became the first female leader of a Tasmanian political party in 1993, and major council amalgamations reduced the number of councils from 46 to 29. Following the Port Arthur massacre on April 28, 1996, which resulted in the loss of 35 lives and injured 21 others, the Australian government conducted a review of its firearms policies and enacted new nationwide gun ownership laws under the National Firearms Agreement. In 2000, Queen Elizabeth II once again visited the state. Guns rose to prominence as a major forestry company during this decade, only to collapse in 2013. In 2004, Premier Jim Bacon died in office from lung cancer. In January 2011, philanthropist David Walsh opened the Museum of Old and New Art in Hobart to international acclaim. Within 12 months, Mona became Tasmania's top tourism attraction. The COVID-19 pandemic in Tasmania resulted in at least 230 cases and 13 deaths as of September 2021. In 2020, after the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic and its spread to Australia, the Tasmanian government issued a public health emergency on March 17, the following month receiving the state's most significant outbreak from the northwest, which required assistance from the federal government. In late 2021, Tasmania was leading the nationwide vaccination response. Language: at the 2021 census, 86% of inhabitants spoke only English at home, with the next most common languages being Mandarin, Nepali, Punjabi and Spanish. Religion: according to the 2021 census, 50% of the Tasmanian population identified as having no religious affiliation. Christianity is followed by 38% of the population. About 4.5% of people in Tasmania follows non-Christian religion, mainly Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. At the 2016 census, the most commonly nominated religions were Anglicanism and Catholicism, while 38% of the population cited no religion. Government: the form of the government of Tasmania is prescribed in its constitution, which dates from 1934. Since 1901, Tasmania has been a state of the Commonwealth of Australia, and the Australian Constitution regulates its relationship with the Commonwealth and prescribes which powers each level of government is allowed. Tasmania is represented in the Senate by 12 senators, on an equal basis with all other states. In the House of Representatives, Tasmania is entitled to 5 seats, which is the minimum allocation for a state guaranteed by the Constitution. The number of House of Representative seats for each state is otherwise decided on the basis of their relative populations, and Tasmania has never qualified for 5 seats on that basis alone. Tasmania's House of Assembly use a system of multi-seat proportional representation known as Hare-Clark. At the 2002 state election, the Labour Party won 14 of the 25 House seats. The people decreased their vote for the Liberal Party, representation in the Parliament fell to 7 seats. The Greens won 4 seats, with over 18% of the popular vote, the highest proportion of any Green Party in any parliament in the world at that time. On February 23, 2004, the Premier Jim Bacon announced his retirement, after being diagnosed with lung cancer. In his last months he opened a vigorous anti-smoking campaign which included many restrictions on where individuals could smoke, such as pubs. He died 4 months later. Bacon was succeeded by Paul Lennon, who, after leading the state for 2 years, went on to win the 2006 state election in his own right. Lennon resigned in 2008 and was succeeded by David Bartlett, who formed a coalition government with the Greens after the 2010 state election resulted in a hung parliament. Bartlett resigned as Premier in January 2011 and was replaced by Laura Giddings, who became Tasmania's first female Premier. In March 2014, Will Hodgman's Liberal Party won government, ending 16 years of Labour governance, and ending an 8-year period for Hodgman himself as leader of the opposition. Hodgman then won a second term of government in the 2018 state election, but resigned mid-term in January 2020 and was replaced by Peter Gutwein. In May 2021, the Tasmanian state election was held after being called early by the incumbent Liberal Party, resulting in their return to government and establishment of a 1-seat majority. It was also the first time that the Liberal Party had been elected 3 times in a row. In April 2022, former Deputy Premier Jeremy Rockliff became Premier after Gutwein announced his retirement from politics. As of April 2023, Tasmania remains the only state governed by the Liberal Party in Australia. Politics. Tasmania has a number of undeveloped regions. Proposals for local economic development have been faced with requirements for environmental sensitivity, or opposition. In particular, proposals for hydroelectric power generation were debated in the late 20th century. In the 1970s, opposition to the construction of the Lake Pedder Reservoir impoundment led to the formation of the world's first Green Party, the United Tasmania Group. In the early 1980s, the state debated the proposed Franklin River Dam. The anti-dam sentiment was shared by many Australians outside Tasmania and proved a factor in the election of the Hawke Labor government in 1983, which halted construction of the dam. Since the 1980s, the environmental focus has shifted to old-growth logging and mining in the Tarkine region, which have both proved divisive. The Tasmania Together process recommended an end to clear felling in high conservation old-growth forests by January 2003, but was unsuccessful. In 1996, the House of Assembly consisted of 35 seats with 7 seats per each of the 5 electorates. By the 1998 election, the number of seats had been reduced down to 25, or 5 per each electorate. This resulted in the reduction of the Greens' number of seats from 4 to 1, and increased the proportion of seats held by both the Labour and Liberal parties. This was despite growth in population and an increase in the voting percentage required for a majority government. There was also no public consultation, and inquiries at the time had recommended the opposite. The House of Assembly Select Committee in 2020 recommended in its report that the number should be increased again from 25 to 35, arguing that such a small representation would undermine democracy and limit the capabilities of the government. In 2010, the major party leadership had even endorsed reinstating the 35-seat number, but Liberal and Labour support was withdrawn the following year, with only the Greens keeping their commitment. Tasmania has 29 local government areas. Local councils are responsible for functions delegated by the Tasmanian Parliament, such as urban planning, road infrastructure, and waste management. Council revenue comes mostly from property taxes and government grants. As with the House of Assembly, Tasmania's local government elections use a system of multi-seat proportional representation known as Hare-Clark. Local government elections take place every 4 years and are conducted by the Tasmanian Electoral Commission by full postal ballot. The next local government elections will be held during October 2026. Economy. Traditionally, Tasmania's main industries have been mining, including copper, zinc, tin, and iron, agriculture, forestry, and tourism. Tasmania is on Australia's electrical grid, and in the 1940s and 1950s, a hydro-industrialisation initiative was embodied in the state by Hydro Tasmania. These all have had varying fortunes over the last century and more, involved in ebbs and flows of population moving in and away dependent upon the specific requirements of the dominant industries of the time. The state also has a large number of food exporting sectors, including but not limited to seafood such as salmon, abalone, and crayfish. In the 1960s and 1970s there was a decline in traditional crops such as apples and pears, with other crops and industries eventually rising in their place. During the 15 years until 2010, new agricultural products such as wine, saffron, pyrethrum, and cherries have been fostered by the Tasmanian Institute of Agricultural Research. Favorable economic conditions throughout Australia, cheaper airfares, and 2 new Spirit of Tasmania ferries have all contributed to what is now a rising tourism industry. About 2% of the Tasmanian population are employed by local government. Other major employers include Nurstar, Norskskog, Grange Resources, Rio Tinto, the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Hobart, and Federal Group. Small business is a large part of the community life, including in Cat, Murilla Estate, and Tassal. In the late 1990s, a number of national companies based their call centers in the state after obtaining cheap access to broadband fiber optic connections. 34% of Tasmanians are reliant on welfare payments as their primary source of income. This number is in part due to the large number of older residents and retirees in Tasmania receiving age pensions. Due to its natural environment and clean air, Tasmania is a common retirement selection for Australians. Culture. Notable titles by Tasmanian authors include The Museum of Modern Love by Heather Rose, The Narrow Road to the Deep North by Richard Flanagan, The Alphabet of Light and Dark by Danielle Wood, The Roving Party by Rohan Wilson, and The Year of Living Dangerously by Christopher Cook, The Rain Queen by Catherine Scholes, Bridget Crack by Rachel Leary, and The Blue Day Book by Bradley Trevor Grieve. A small part of Helen Garner's Monkey Grip is set in Hobart as the main characters take a sojourn there. Children's books include They Found a Cave by Nan Chauncey, The Museum of Thieves by Leanne Tanner, Finding Serendipity, A Week Without Tuesday, and Blueberry Pancakes Forever by Angelica Banks, Tiger Tail by Marion and Steve Isham. Tasmania is home to the eminent literary magazine that was formed in 1979, Island Magazine, and the biennial Tasmanian Writers and Readers Festival, now renamed the Hobart Writers Festival. Tasmanian Gothic is a literary genre which expresses the island state's peculiar otherness in relation to the mainland, as a remote, mysterious, and self-enclosed place. Marcus Clarke's novel For the Term of His Natural Life, written in the 1870s and set in convict-era Tasmania, is a seminal example. This distinctive Gothic is not just restricted to literature, but can be represented through all the arts, such as in painting, music, or architecture. Sport. Sport is an important pastime in Tasmania, and the state has produced several famous sportsmen and women and also hosted several major sporting events. The Tasmanian Tigers cricket team represents the state successfully, for example the Sheffield Shield in 2007, 2011 and 2013, and plays its home games at the Bellerive Oval in Hobart, which is also the home ground for the Hobart Hurricanes in the Big Bash League. In addition, Bellerive Oval regularly hosts international cricket matches. Famous Tasmanian cricketers include David Boon, former Australian captains Ricky Ponting and Tim Payne. Australian rules football in Tasmania is the most watched form of football, and a Tasmanian team was awarded a licence to enter the Australian Football League in 2028 to be based out of a new Macquarie Point Stadium. AFL matches have been played since 2001 at Aurora Stadium in Launceston and Bellerive Oval in Hobart. Local leagues include the North West Football League and Tasmanian State League. Soccer in Tasmania is the most participated football code, and there is an active Tasmanian A-League bid. The existing statewide league is the NPL Tasmania. Rugby union is also played in Tasmania and is governed by the Tasmanian Rugby Union. 10 clubs take part in the statewide Tasmanian rugby competition. Tasmania hosts the professional Moorilla International Tennis Tournament as part of the lead-up to the Australian Open, and is played at the Hobart International Tennis Centre, Hobart. The Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race is an annual event starting in Sydney, NSW, on Boxing Day and finishing in Hobart, Tasmania. It is widely considered to be one of the most difficult yacht races in the world. In basketball, Tasmania has previously been represented in the National Basketball League by Launceston Casino City, the Devonport Warriors, and the Hobart Devils. Since the 2021-22 NBL season, Tasmania has been represented by the Tasmania Jack Jumpers, a statewide franchise which plays its home games in both Hobart and Launceston. The Jack Jumpers secured their maiden NBL championship in the 2023-24 season, marking Tasmania's first NBL title since Launceston Casino City in 1981. Cuisine. Tasmanian Aboriginal people had a diverse diet, including native currants, pig face, and native plums, and a wide range of birds and kangaroos. Seafood has always been a significant part of the Tasmanian diet, including its wide range of shellfish, which are still commercially farmed, such as crayfish, orange roughy, salmon and oysters. Seal meat also formed a significant part of the Aboriginal diet. Tasmania's non-Aboriginal cuisine has a unique history to mainland Australia. It has developed through many subsequent waves of immigration. Tasmanian traditional foods include scallop pies, a pie filled with scallops in curry, and curry powder, which was popularized by Keen's curry in the 19th century. Tasmania also produces and consumes wasabi, saffron, truffles, and leatherwood honey. Tasmania now has a wide range of restaurants, in part due to the arrival of immigrants and changing cultural patterns. Scattered across Tasmania are many vineyards, and Tasmanian beer brands such as Boag's and Cascade are known and sold in mainland Australia. King Island off the northwestern coast of Tasmania has a reputation for boutique cheeses and dairy products. The Central Cookery Book was written in 1930 by A.C. Irvine and is still popular in Australia and even internationally. Tasmanian cuisine is often unique and has won many awards. One example is the Hartshorn Distillery, which has won prizes in the World Vodka Awards for 3 years in a row since 2017. Events. To foster tourism, the state government encourages or supports several annual events in and around the island. The best known of these is the Sydney to Hobart Yacht Race, starting on Boxing Day in Sydney and usually arriving at Constitution Dock in Hobart around 3 to 4 days later, during the Taste of Tasmania, an annual food and wine festival. Other events include the Target Tasmania Rally, which attracts rally drivers from around the world and is staged all over the state, over 5 days. Rural or regional events include Eggfest, a 3-day agricultural show held at Carrick in early May, and NASA-supported Tastrofest, Tasmania's astronomy festival, held early August in Ulverstone. The Royal Hobart Show and Royal Launceston Show are both held in October annually. Music events held in Tasmania include the Falls Festival at Marion Bay, the Festival of Voices, a national celebration of song held each year in Hobart attracting international and national teachers and choirs in the heart of winter, and MS Fest, a charity music event held in Launceston to raise money for those with multiple sclerosis. The Cygnet Folk Festival is one of Australia's most iconic folk music festivals and is held in Cygnet in the Huon Valley every year in January. The Tasmanian Lute Festival is an early music event held in different locations in Tasmania every 2 years. Recent additions to the state arts events calendar include the 10 Days on the Island Arts Festival, Mona FOMA, run by David Walsh and curated by Brian Ritchie, and Dark Mofo, also run by David Walsh and curated by Lee Carmichael. The Unconformity is a 3-day festival held every 2 years in Queenstown on the west coast. Each February in Avondale a penny farthing championships are held. Perception within Australia. Tasmania is perceived within Australia and internationally as an island with pristine wildlife, water, and air. It is known for its ecotourism for these reasons, and is considered an idyllic location for Australians considering a tree or sea change, or are seeking retirement because of Tasmania's temperate environment and friendly locals. In other parts of the world, Tasmania is considered as the opposite side of the planet to most places, and supposedly home to mythically exotic animals, such as the Tasmanian devil as popularized by Warner Brothers. Tasmania has a reputation within Australia that is often at odds with the reality of the state, or may have only been true during colonial times and has only persevered on the Australian mainland as a myth. Because of these stereotypes, Tasmania is often referred to as the primary target of mainland Australian jokes. In more recent times, references to insults against Tasmania are more sarcastic and jovial, but angst against the island still exists. The most commonly cited sarcastic comment is on the supposedly two-headed Tasmanians, which originated due to some colonists developing goiters from the low amount of iodine in the island's soil. But as Tasmania receives higher volumes of interstate tourists, the perceptions are in the process of changing. The most prominent example of negative stereotype is of inbreeding due to the relatively small size of Tasmania compared to the rest of Australia. This is untrue, and if it had once been the case, it would have existed in the rest of colonial Australia as well, though Tasmania's penal establishments were some of the harshest in the entire colony and home to infamous bushrangers. This is a part of the also receding global stereotype that all Australians are or were derived from criminals, even as most convicts were transported for petty crimes. During this period of European settlement, Tasmania was the second centre of power and a significant port of the British Empire on the continent after New South Wales, before being surpassed in the latter half of the 19th century by Victoria and regions sustained by mining booms following the cessation of transportation in 1853. A mentality developed in certain corners of Australia, and led to a general dislike of Tasmania amongst these people, even if the opinion holder had never properly visited. It can rise to such an extent as to argue for the secession of Tasmania from the rest of Australia, in an effort to recover Australia's reputation from Tasmania.